Hello, and welcome to my backyard. My name is Dana Abbott, and today you can see me in my Hawaiian shirt in the backyard, relaxed. And that's what I want to talk about, being relaxed with a sword. Of course, you can't be too relaxed where you don't pay attention and you might cut something off. But nevertheless, if you're more high-strung and you're trying to do the sword in an expedient manner, chances are you'll probably make a mistake that will have devastating consequences. And that's what I want to talk about in depth now and, of course, in the future. Safety is a very important factor. I've spoken and I've talked to lots of sword people throughout the world. And one of the main things they noticed is when they were young, they didn't see how dangerous they were. But when they got a little older, they started saying, wow, I was a crazy SOB when I was younger. It's sort of like being 20 years old and you're indestructible. But when you turn 40 and you have a 20-year-old kid, you look back onto yourself, because you're looking at a mini you, of course, and you're saying, God, he's going to kill himself. Remember, the older you get dealing with a sword, everything depends on safety, because it isn't you that's going to drop the sword. It's going to be someone else dropping it on your foot that, again, will have dire consequences. A few days ago, I received the sword from John Pope. He's been working on some very interesting and classical designs that caught my eye. And the reason why is, it's nice to come across someone who works on a sword the old ways using new methods. It makes it nice. But the coolest thing about this was, before I got a hold of it, Tom Urso, and you all know who Tom Urso is, he started working it and test cutting with bamboo. Over here in Arizona, we don't have too much bamboo. So I sent it back east. He worked on lots of different cuts, and of course, it passed the bamboo test. Today, though, I want to talk about not how this sword's action is in relation to me and how well I look at it. I want you to look at this as more of, together, we're going to work on a few things that you've been probably thinking about, but you don't know who to ask. Let me get the sword now. This is a real nice blade. I hear it was originally made for people who practice iaido. Iaido is the practice of drawing the sword, cutting, and sheathing the sword again. When I pull the sword out of the sheath, has nice weight. The tsuba is a little thin right at this time, which makes it a little top heavy, but nothing that you'll know past maybe 20 or 30 grams. After I put a different tsuba on it, it will make it balance out really nice. The cool thing I like about this particular sword is it's a strong, nice weapon, and it holds the edge very well. And after I examined it, I noticed that there are no really marks, or there's no chips, there's no deep scratching or anything from cutting a lot of older bamboo. When I say older bamboo, end of the year, winter bamboo, so it isn't lush and soft. It takes a little bit more of time and effort to cut through it. Nevertheless, looking at the kisaki, the monouchi, the hamon, and all these areas here, it's nice. But you already know that. What I'd like to talk about is, what do you do when you first get a sword and you go, well, what am I going to do with it next? Especially if you have fear of the blade. A lot of us really wanted to go out and get a dull iaito, or a dull metal sword. The only problem is it costs almost as much as a real sword. But when we get a real sword, how do we draw it? How do we pull it out? How do we sheath it? How do we work it around our bodies? Especially since we don't have formal training. Formal training is a real factor in this day and age. It's hard to find. And if you do find a good instructor, chances are he's a couple 100 miles away and you can only go there once or twice a month. I mean, it's just that way. A lot of times you find out that you can learn the Japanese sword, but you got to practice another art first, like Aikido. You got to practice that until you become a kurobi, or you become a black belt, like a first degree, second degree black belt, and then they start working you with weapons, mainly because it's still a safety factor. And if you have good safety in your training, you'll never get cut. Well, you'll get cut a couple times, but it won't require as many stitches. Another aspect, what I'd like you to look at, is that when you are looking for a teacher, you've run into the chance where they weren't very pleasant to be around. You run around a lot of sword people that, for some reason, what did I do to piss them off this time? You have that feeling. Why aren't they being friendly? You have to remember this. By the time someone goes into hardcore sorting, they become more of an elitist. And the reason why is they put a lot of polishing into their technique. The hard part arises is that the humility factor is half. We're doing the sword the Western way, not the Oriental way. If you learn hardcore traditional Japanese, Iaido, Bato, or working with a Ken, the simple thing is that you have humility thrown in there from the time you were a little kid. And remember, if you don't have anything nice to say, don't say anything at all. Japanese are very good at that. Here in the Western countries, everybody has a tendency to get a little nose high like this after they get a little bit of technique down. I don't know why. Let's just say that's human nature. With that aside, when you run into teachers or students of teachers who have this air about them, just let it pass, because it doesn't help dwelling on those factors, especially if you're looking for a good school to work with. And chances are you'll never find one. It'll be easier to find a school on how to play tennis or how to fire a firearm. Now, there's something that would be different. If I was Japanese and I was in Japan and I was learning how to shoot a firearm, who am I going to ask? Very few places I can go. Military, police, for example. But if we switch back here to America, I want you to know that if you can't find it, don't worry about it, because you're doing fine doing your own thing. And remember, all good swordsmen who wrote a lot of the books, they went up into the hill and they lived in a cave for a few years, practicing their art to hone and fine touch all their technique. You're doing the same thing in your backyard. So then again, let's be relaxed and let's start thinking about, what do people do? Well, first of all, we got to think about bad habits, because bad habits go hand in hand with safety. The more bad habits you have, the more safety rules you have to follow. That's why they beat you with a pound of cure. You don't need a pound of cure. If you just had a basic, just a little bit of prevention, it'll alleviate the whole problem. So what do we need to do? Simple. We need to make sure that when we use our sword and we take the sword out of the sheath, it's like taking a firearm out of the holster. You don't point it at anybody, and if you're a beginner, you don't do anything wild. Just imagine that you have a .22 or a .30-30 or a .30-06. Let's make it even more interesting. Say someone lets you use an MP5. Little machine gun, and you're shooting it, you're doing really well, and your little brother or your son or someone younger than you that doesn't have the responsibility pick it up, and they go like this, shooting at this thing, and they turn around pointing the thing at you. Did you see that? Well, that's what you're doing with a sword around a lot of people. And even though you don't see the fear factor, everybody else does. Point. It would be better to practice by yourself and in your backyard, usually later at night, unless you're cutting a few things. That way you won't have neighbors peering through the windows bothering you all the time. And that's one of the biggest factors, nosy neighbors. But those nosy neighbors see some wild and crazy things you do. For example, let me take the sheath and lay it down over there. A lot of times when we set up and practice, we do a lot of overkill. We lift up the sword and we swing it way down like this. But then we take that bad habit of not being able to stop it correctly, and we follow through, and then all of a sudden, instead of stopping it, we go, well, you know, let's put a little spin in this. So you do an overzealous swing, and you bring it around, you cut through a water bottle or tatami mat or whatever, you finish making that swing, and all of a sudden you come back around and you swing it again. It feels good. When you see yourself on video, you look good. But if someone's looking from a distance, they're seeing some wild and crazy guy out there almost ready to cut off his arm because they don't have control. You took an object that was going too fast to handle, you didn't have control in it, so you followed through with it. But the rest of those cuts are just fancy things that over time you're going to change. Again, going back to a firearm. When an expert becomes an expert, you don't see anything fancy. Just point, shoot, hit him in the head every time. A beginner is going to go boom, 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 boom like that, and he'll probably shoot a bunch of people standing by, or civilians, if you know what I mean. A lot of collateral damage because they're trying to look good, but their executed techniques are substandard and very dangerous. So there might be a few of you out there that go, wait a minute, I do this spinny thing really, really well. And I bet you do. But take in consideration, after you get past that technique, what are you going to turn the Japanese sword into a Chinese kung fu whip snap thing? Doesn't make sense, does it? So what I'd like you to do is basic strike, keeping your elbows in, making sure your hands are ringing the blade, and not over as much, just enough to keep your elbows in and your shoulders in, so you're not going to pull any muscles here. Another important factor is you get a new sword like this and you're going, well, you know, I really want to use it, but what can I do? Because I'm scared of the blade. Blade is fairly dangerous. Suggestions. I do this all the time. If I was someone who was learning to use a sword, and of course you want to cut some bottles because a lot of people do cut water bottles, I'd probably cut it with a monouchi about right here. This is called your sweet spot. You can see it from about here to here. If you can be consistent in cutting the water bottles with this, and you want to draw and sheathe the sword a lot, I would take the kisaki with a piece of emery board and take off this whole area with emery board and make it fairly dull. So when I bring the sword and I sheathe it and I put it away and I draw it, I'll be able to do it a little faster, but without the dangerous tip involved, because if I make one mistake, there's a lot of stitches in my hand, even jamming it back in. Because a lot of times when we practice, we start losing the safety factor. Now, to be realistic, it took me a good 10 years to be able to draw the sword. And this is after hundreds of thousands of draws where this doesn't matter if this is a razor sharp sword or if it isn't. A lot of us talk about my sword has to be really, really sharp. Not necessarily. It's not a scalpel. If it was a little bitty 2-inch blade, I'd assume I'd want a razor edge on it. But something as big as this, if you put a razor edge on it, chances are you're going to chip it a lot more. So don't think that your classical weapon needs to be that sharp. Now, this is a fairly sharp blade. It will cut through bamboo. It will take your head off. Let's see how well it cuts paper. A lot of times you can see that when you use a sword on how it cuts paper. Now, I'm going to cut it in the kisaki area here, up in front, all the way over here to the monouchi, and this is where we mostly spent time cutting all that bamboo, and let's see if it still holds an edge. It holds an edge fairly well. It's not too bad. It isn't razor sharp, so you see that the paper has a little bit of leftover edge there, which is fine. If I come down here towards the base a little bit more and cut, let's look at this, and the edge is a little bit sharper, which means that this monouchi here is a little duller than down here at the base of the blade, which is no big problem because it doesn't matter if it's sharp if you have the right wrist action. And of course, good strong wrist action works well in any sport, any endeavor. So take that into consideration. Since this will cut this paper fairly easily, and it leaves enough, what will we say, serrated edge on the sides here where you can hear it like that. Don't think, again, that you need a razor sharp sword. Now, a lot of times when people start using a blade, they have a hard time taking the sword and drawing it and sheathing it. Let's take a second or so and work on that a bit. I'll take the sword, I'll put it down like this. I'm going to come over here and grab one of my belts. Now, usually you see a belt over this, over a keikogi or a kendogi or, some of the traditional garb, but you can see as my Hawaiian shirt fits just as well if I take this and I sort of turn into it and turn it a couple of times, and I go from one edge to another. And I make it fairly tight, because a lot of times when we tighten up the belt, we make it too tight, and it doesn't fit on the hips as well. So if you really want a feel of it, it almost feels like the bottom part of the belt is tight on my hips, but the top part of the belt, I can easily put a thumb in there. And the reason why is it gives you a little bit more movement. Now, of course, if we were going to go skydiving with this, I'd, take the belt and I'd really notch it up a little bit. But as a general rule, just fumble around with a knot, take it, bring it down like this, pull it in, and then after you do that, and I'm not being fancy today, I'm in the backyard, relaxed. Now I bring the sword back, not the sword, but the belt back down here. It's sort of hastily tightened back, and now I feel pretty good about this. What I'd like to do next is grab the saya or the sheath, put it in my belt. Now if I had my sword with me, I'd put it in all together, but we're in the backyard and we don't have any teachers looking at us as much. Now I'm going to grab my sword here like this, and now I'm going to take and put this away. The nice thing about this blade made by John Pope is that the feeling of it when I draw it in and out of my hands is very, very smooth. I run across a lot of swords that are nice, but it isn't comfortable, and this is a very comfortable blade. It's a little wide, so if you start cutting bottles, for example, it won't cut through as fast, but then again, bottles are just a beginning factor. What you want to do eventually is get to wooden dowels, and then 1x1s, and eventually 2x2s if you're using a heavier sword, of course tatami mats and all that. There are other types of, exercises we can work on at a later date. What I'd like you to understand though is, if I take this sword out and I put it back together like this, draw it and bring it out, you notice my fingers are on the blade. Now a lot of us are going to take the blade and let me adjust, and they're going to adjust it around their belt. Now they'll probably be looking at it, their fingers will be wide open like this, and you're going to try to work it in, which is difficult. But over time, here's what you want to strive for. You want to strive for 3 types of sheathing or drawing patterns. One is horizontal. This is your most classical one, where you work it in like that. The second one is a diagonal one, where you work at 45 degrees, basically making sure the sheath and the sword itself meet up in the middle so they both fall into the same angle. And of course, you want to also deal with one that is more vertical like this. The vertical ones are probably the easiest ones to do and understand. Of course, after that, the diagonal ones, they work in here very nicely too. Just see how that works. But the horizontal or the classical ones do offer the most difficult aspect or more challenging part about it, because you want to keep everything really smooth like this. So just take your time and make sure that your hands and the swords are doing well. After you've done horizontal, diagonal, and vertical, now when you pull out the sword or you put it away, you put it away like this, bring it back in, and then turn it up the last second. So you go twist upward or corkscrew it up from a horizontal to a vertical manner. When you pull out the sword, bring it around here to almost the very end and then turn it down this way, and this will allow you to make a much better cut off of a horizontal position when you draw the sword. With that understood, you'll have a much easier time drawing the sword down the road. Now, there's a lot of us that really don't like drawing the sword as much. Spend your time with the sheath somewhere else, and just know when you have a live blade in your hand and you're trying to cut different things, don't put as much pressure into it. And that's what I'm going to work on next. Pressure of the cut through something as common in Japan as a tatami mat. And let's work on that now. Let me put the sword away and set up a tatami mat to do a little test cutting. With this tatami mat set into place, this tatami mat has the same consistency of a neck with not a lot of vertebrae in it. It will cut through it really, really well, I hope so, because I've never cut with this blade before. So far, the action on this blade has been very, very nice, but let's see what it does when we want to cut through something as average as a tatami mat. When you practice cutting with tatami mats, it's a little bit different than cutting with a bottle. Of course, you have the liquid behind it that gives it its weight, so when you pressure through with your blade, it cuts fairly easy, especially if you only have little plastic around. This takes it up another level. So what I'd like you to understand is, if you can make cuts here fairly consistently, you're doing well. But what you don't want to do is make a swing, come back around and swing again. It just looks so Hollywood, which it looks nice and it looks interesting. It just isn't practical one bit. Remember, no one wants to be next to someone who's swinging a sword wildly or pointing a gun around wildly. So, with that thought process, let's assume that you took the edge off right around here so you can easily put the sword away and take it back. Then, you keep this area sharp here, of course, and we'll just cut through the Mona Uchi area and see what we have. So what I'm going to do is, instead of swinging up really high like this, and trying to turn my head over like I'm going to eat a taco, I'm going to stand a little bit taller, and my shoulders are going to come here at an angle like this, so when I cut into it, I won't have to worry about leaning and adjusting this much. You remember, you're not doing someone's nails and you don't have to see this close. You can see from a sword's length distance away. And the more you basically thumb your nose down onto the target like this, the straighter your back will be, and the better you'll be able to set up for the next strike. But if you start swinging wildly in either one way or another, of course, since you're young, you have good strong muscles, you'll be able to control it that way. But how many people have worked out with a martial art expert and you got hurt? You got punched in the nose. He should have been an expert. He should have had that focus. Well, let's just add 100 times onto this, because one mistake again will lead to dire consequences. Therefore, if I'm going to cut a mat like this, let's keep it very, very simple. I can either stand in front at the angle, but you can see where the blade is coming in this way. So now what I'm going to do is, I'm just going to lift the blade back this way, I'm going to shibori it in, keep my elbows together, and instead of going like this, like everybody does, like, oh, I have to, like you're playing pool and you're going to do something like that and you keep working on it back and forth, don't. Keep your eyes on the target. Don't take your eyes off the target. That's why I have never met a Japanese sword master do a spinning flip, turn around and cut something again, because they don't do that. So, we come up this way. I lift the sword here, making sure my forearm's together, and I shibori it well, and I make a strike. Now, you notice I didn't cut all the way through. And I gave it a basic, what will we say? We call it pressure. And this pressure would allow me to cut through this, but why didn't it cut through it? I wasn't strong enough. I was using the same force I would with a water bottle, because it doesn't require that much. But since you're doing this, and you go, wait a minute, I didn't cut through the first time, or you cut through the first time really well, and the second time goes like this. Most people, they'll go, well, I got to throw in more pressure, which creates more bad habits. What you really need to do is put this back up where it is, follow the same angle, but shibori it with your hands a little bit more. So now I'm going to do the exact same cut. I'm going to pull it back like this, the exact same area, but now I'm going to take it and I'm going to follow through a little bit more. And can you see the difference? And you notice the sword stopped here. It didn't fly around. Because from here to here is where you have your cut. Actually, the topography here would be the topography here on your neck. So you only have to cut in a little bit. You're not trying to cut an elephant's leg, because most people try to, especially if you don't have a target. They're up here and they start swinging the sword around like a crazy person. But let's try another cut. So what you want to do is, after you make your first initial cut, do what they do, is same as grouping like you would with a firearm. If you shoot the first round and it goes off into the corner, maybe you want all of them to group over there. Think of it that way too. But this way I'm going to lift the sword up, not going to taco it as much. I'm going to come in, and if I start leaning over to the right, I'll turn blade my heels out a little bit, make me more pigeon-toed to make my shoulders and back a little bit straighter. And now, this way, testing, 1, 2, 3, yep. And now, this way, I come up with a sword and I cut again. Now, what I did is what everybody else is going to do. Is when you get to this area here, did you see this? Well, what happens? It's when the blade is cutting through, you don't have enough pressure, and you turn your hands inward and outward. So what happened here is, I didn't scoop it as much, but towards the end, I sort of became lackadaisical, and it came off this way a little bit. So a lot of you who do cut tatami mats, you might get frustrated because these aren't easy puppies to cut. Although, if you bring the sword around this way and cut up, you'll notice that the whole thing moved. So what I'm trying to show here, why I'm butchering this into a nice flower, is not saying that, I'm trying to show you the perfect cuts, because you only see perfect cuts in the movies. What I'm trying to show you is what's going to happen when you start cutting tatami mats. And you start going, well, this isn't any fun. Neither is playing golf when you're not relaxed. So what must you do is think safety, be relaxed, adjust the sword where it is, and then make your shot like this. You can see how much easier it is. Now, of course, there's a lot of topography because I cut over the exact same cut. But that's what I want you to look at. Don't try to be a superhero. Be human, practice hard, be consistent, safe, and you also will start to understand the way of the sword a little more.